Playbook breakfast. Appreciate your coming out early. Very excited to have some of Washington's most fascinating and most respected correspondents here who's going to talk about what we just saw and are going to give us a preview of what we're about to see. We're going to have them come on just in a second. Three of them are best-selling authors. And so we'll be talking a little bit about their books too. Welcome our panel. Come on up. Peter. Thanks, Mark.
Hi, darling. How are you?
Hey, dear.
Hey, Mikey.
Hey, man. Thank you very much. So we have Jake Tapper of CNN, who this year started The Lead on CNN, and he's author of The Outpost, an amazing war story that now is available in paperback, but on Amazon still available in hardback. It's a great gift. You probably have not heard, and next we have Kelly O'Donnell, NBC News White House correspondent, former ed-bed in Iraq, has covered news in LA, New York. You probably have not heard, but Mark Leibovich had a book this year. This Town, also a New York Times bestseller, and Peter Baker, Chief White House correspondent of the New York Times, a friend since the Washington Post days when you were covering Mary Sue Terry. And I was with the Richmond Times-Dispatch. And Peter's amazing book about the Bush administration, Days of Fire, an amazing work. 7 years of work went into this book. And this weekend, the New York Times Magazine picked it as one of the 5 best nonfiction books of the year. So kick things off, Jake Tapper. If you could interview anyone in 2014, who would it be?
First, can I say how I met you, Mike? Because I wasn't lucky enough to know you in the Richmond Times-Dispatch days, but I met you. We were at the Reform Party convention in 1990.
With Matt Labash.
With Matt Labash in Dearborn, Michigan, and you were with the New York Times. Darting around. It was quite an exciting convention.
He's still darting.
That was when Jesse Ventura was talking about taking over the party. Good times. So.
Wait, I thought Jesse Ventura was your pick for who to interview.
He's not.
Okay.
I mean, if it's anyone in the world.
You're Jake Tapper, sure.
I guess Edward Snowden. I would love to interview him and really do a long interview with him about not just his life, but the leaks and what he has leaked and why he did it. And then a very close second would be Pope Francis. And I don't know which one is likelier to happen or less likely to happen. I'm willing to travel to Russia, to Brazil, to Hong Kong, or to the Vatican for any of those interviews.
Okay. So Edward Snowden, if you're watching on the live stream, you have an interviewer. And what would you like to know when you were done talking to him that you don't know now?
About Edward Snowden?
Or His Holiness?
Well, His Holiness, I'd like to know what he makes of all the talk and commentary about how different he is from his predecessors. I wonder how much he actually feels he is in terms of substance versus
and how intentional it is.
Tone, yeah, and how intentional it is versus how much it is media jumping on comments. When you read the comments that he has made, it does not seem accidental. It does not seem as though the media is jumping on this to drive a wedge between him and his predecessors. In terms of Snowden, I think in addition, you'd want to do an actual program by program takedown on what he objects to and why he has leaked. But I think psychologically you'd want to know what made the snap, what made him decide to do this incredibly bold and risky act. What drove it psychologically for him in terms of, because it's not like you go into the National Security Agency thinking that you're not going to be conducting surveillance and there aren't going to be perhaps questionable practices, or at least ones that are on the edge. So what was the moment?
Kelly O'Donnell, you're Kelly O on Twitter and on Morning Joe. They seem to think that that's your name. You're up on Capitol Hill for this amazing year. And last week on the day that Paul Ryan and Patty Murray made their deal, Reuters did a story, which was in Playbook, with the headline, U.S. budget deal could usher in new era of cooperation. What are the chances?
Well, I think there is a moment for some modest cooperation. I think there is a certain buzz that isn't getting along, a worthwhile thing. We've seen that before. I think there is a certain premium that the public is giving to lawmakers right now to encourage them to get along. I think the sort of institutional forces make that difficult, but if they get enough sort of praise and feel a payoff for getting along, I think that can be helpful. So that's sort of my optimistic sense. I think that can go off the rails at any point.
Mark Leibovich, yesterday we were emailing about like some possible topics, and I asked you what mistake DC journalists often make, and you told me
Just one.
most often.
Agreeing to do the Playbook breakfast.
And in second choice, thinking that the elected officials they're writing about, and so what's the mistake journalists make? And they said that thinking too much about the officials we're writing about, acting so solicitous of them and wanting to be their friends. Have you ever made that mistake?
I was actually, you did not, I was worried that just this follow-up would happen. First of all, I actually thought the first question I would get was, why did you agree to do this? And I'm thrilled to be here, so thank you all for coming. I made that, it wasn't a mistake. It was a reality. And it happened once. It was...
Oh, come on. Once?
No, well, I think so. Put it this way. No, I am friendly with many, many public officials. There was one public figure who I felt like, I had a personal relationship that I would not write about. And that happened about 7.5 years ago. My wife had breast cancer. And I was writing, or she was diagnosed with breast cancer. And I was writing a profile of Elizabeth Edwards and John Edwards the weekend after she announced that she'd had this relapse. And I was supposed to be the first print interviewer of them like that weekend in Vegas. That day, my wife, out of nowhere gets this diagnosis, and I told her then, PR rep Jennifer Palmieri, I can't make it. And then Elizabeth Edwards called, and she was just an incredible friend through that. So at that point, I recused myself from all Elizabeth Edwards or Edwards-related stories.
Okay, pull back the camera. Why are journalists too solicitous of public officials?
Too solicitous? I think you have to ask the individual journalist. I do think one of the big mistakes in journalism and in Washington generally is that people accrue their own self-worth to the institution they're working for and the function they're trying to play, meaning people think that, politician X is being so nice to me and so solicitous of me because they really like me and they think I'm special and we actually could be friends, and it's really cool that, Senator X and Congressman Y come to my wedding and look at this and we can show all this off. In fact, you realize that, it can be a real seduction game, and you can lose your distance very easily.
Kelly, you've known some of these senators and members for years and years. How do you avoid having them think you're their friend?
Well, I don't think we're personal friends. I think we're professional friends. And I think there is value in being warm and friendly and know about their kids and know about their spouse and know about some of their interests that are not directly related to what you're covering. I think there's a lot of benefit in the simple niceties of life, in getting along, but I don't think I'm personal friends with anyone I cover.
Who up there in the House leadership or the senators is friendliest? Like most wants to hang out with the press, or like maybe thinks the press is their friend?
Wow, that's a danger. The trap door is right here. I think there are very, very, I think politics often will draw into it the people who have that tactile need, that need for...
Not answering your question.
Yeah, I'm not going to name a name, only because I have to go to work there today. But I do think there are friendly people, and I appreciate that friendliness. I find that I have maybe the best relationship with people I have been in their home states or districts and seen them in that setting, and then in Washington. I think there's a different dimension to knowing them in that way.
So what is Speaker Boehner like when reporters are around but cameras aren't on?
He is pretty frank and direct, I think.
Smoking?
Yes. I thought I should even alert fire officials at one point because I thought I smelled smoke and I realized, we're just right near his private space. He is very warm. I think he actually likes interacting with reporters more than it may appear. And I think he is willing to give us some of his perspective on how things are working that he's not as free or chooses not to be as free to say publicly. And I enjoy those moments because it does help you interpret his public activities and his public statements a bit more if you have a sense of what he was thinking when there were no cameras around.
So Peter Baker, you have this amazing history out about the 8 years of the Bush administration, but you're also one of the most astute observers of the Obama administration. Yesterday, Ron Fournier posted a story online with the headline, "This is the end of the presidency." Now, that was a trick. That was a quote referring to Bush. But his point was that there are a lot of parallels between the 5th year of Obama and the 5th year of Bush. How deep is the Obama hole? Is it Bush deep?
Well, there are parallels, and I think we get sort of wrapped up in this sort of silly debate. A website isn't a hurricane. All that's true. But hey, you know, you're here first. But the truth is that what's similar.
I believe it was your newspaper that on the front page, tried to make that.
Well, I think the case we made on the front page was that the
your book party.
political positioning of where these two presidents are at this stage of their administration is similar. Obviously for different reasons and different dynamics, but the point was that President Obama, 1 year after his re-election, has found himself, his credibility challenged, the trust that people had in him has diminished. He now has more than 50% say they don't think he is telling the truth all the time. His reputation for competence and effectiveness is challenged in the same way that President Bush's was at this point. And you saw in President Bush the potential ramifications of that. He fell below 50% approval ratings in March of his 5th year in office, and he never got above that again for the rest of his presidency. He went longer than any president before with less than majority support. And that has tangible impact. He didn't get Social Security in his second term. He didn't get immigration in his second term. The ownership society, which he sort of articulated as a domestic agenda for the last 4 years of his administration, didn't go anywhere. And that's the danger for President Obama. Now, the difference is that the overarching albatross for President Bush was the Iraq War. President Obama doesn't have that. He, in theory, can get past this moment. In theory, can recover. But as one Democrat put it to me, he says, you can lose 10 points in a week, but you can't get 10 points back in a week. You tend to get it back 1 point at a time.
Peter, in Days of Fire, Bush and Cheney in the White House, you have a sentence here that says, even to the extent that President Bush salvaged a failing war through the surge after years of letting his generals call the shots, Bush could not ultimately salvage his presidency. At this moment, is it possible that the presidency looks better than Iraq?
Yeah, that's a good question. He's definitely in a better place today with the American public than he was when he left office. His numbers actually are in some ways better than Obama's. He in Gallup in the summer, he had a 49% favorability rating versus 46 unfavorables. That's the first time in 8 years he had had a positive net. And I think that results from the fact that, A, in general, we tend to be more reflective and fonder about our ex-presidents than we are in the moment when we're feeling so passionate. B, I think that his quiet grace after leaving office has probably helped him with a lot of people who might have been mad.
Why does he do that? He has this amazing platform that Bill Clinton, he's used in a different way. You got amazing access to Bush aides, Cheney aides. Well, what did they tell you about why he's run so clearly under the radar?
Well, I think A, it's a reaction to the fact that he didn't much like former presidents, second guessing him when he was in office. President Carter, call your office. I mean, I think that he reacted badly to that. Doesn't want to do that to President Obama. B, I think he's just tired of politics. He's just done. He said to a dinner party in Dallas one night after leaving office that when he saw Obama's hand go up on Inauguration Day, he thought to himself, "Free at last, free at last." I mean, he had been through so many days of fire, if you pardon the conceit of the title. Sorry, yeah, is that good?
Very
like
nice, yeah, very nice.
Only happened in this town.
Yeah, good.
That when he's leaving office, he's giving
Following
it.
the same playbook.
Okay, we're going to send you the Outpost if you don't watch out.
he's leaving office. He's giving an award to Morgan Freeman, the actor, and he recalls that Morgan Freeman had been president himself in a movie called Deep Impact. And Bush says to the audience, "That's the one where the comet hits the planet and destroys all civilization." And then he kind of goes off script and says, "That's about the only thing that hadn't happened in the last 8 years." And I think he was exhausted. I think he had had enough and didn't want to be part of the whole environment anymore.
Now, President Bush, who flew with President Obama, hitched a ride, as Bush used to say himself, hitched a ride on Air Force One to the Nelson Mandela funeral. He afterwards, during the flight, came back, chatted with the reporters longer than he chatted with reporters on Air Force One, probably in his whole presidency combined. Now, for the reporters who were there, it was off the record. You weren't there. What have you heard about his mood or what he said? What does he think of Days of Fire?
I'm under no obligation. The reports I've heard are that he came back for like 90 minutes. He actually left at one point, comes back with Laura a second time, and I think without giving anything away that is too specific, I think in general he was very relaxed. He was chit-chatting about painting in particular. Obviously he's picked up the hobby. We'll see if he paints Steve Holland someday. But he was chatting about his life today. I think he was chatting about his presidency. He was reflecting on some world leaders, things like that. I think he was asked about the book. He didn't participate in the book, and I think he says he hasn't read it. So we'll.
And very generally, what does he think of it?
Well, I think that in general, without, again, giving away anything from that particular conversation, I think that the thing that I imagined he would be upset about with the book is, if for nothing else, the equal billing with Cheney. Why is Cheney on the cover, And I think that the reason we framed the book that way is because if you're going to write a book about the Bush presidency, you kind of had to address that question anyway. So why not use this rather extraordinary and interesting relationship, and particularly more interesting, I think, than we really quite knew at the time. Why not use that as a narrative structure for the 8-year story? And so I think while the book actually kind of tries to puncture the myth that Cheney was somehow the secret puppet master running everything, I think President Bush is probably annoyed that he's on the cover with him.
Now, Jake Tapper, this year you launched The Lead at 4 p.m. on CNN after having been chief White House correspondent for ABC News. What was it like to adapt from the role of correspondent, very high profile, to anchor?
It's a completely different job. I mean, it would be, I imagine, going from being a reporter to an editor. You're responsible for an entire hour. I don't have to beg to get on air. I don't have to convince anybody to get on air. But ultimately also, the flip side is true, is that I'm responsible. If there's a mess up, I'm responsible. If there's a story selection that wasn't the best, I'm responsible. For the ratings, I'm responsible. So there is a greater freedom editorially to assert what I think is important and cover things that I had trouble getting on air as a correspondent, especially when narrowly confined to the beat of the White House. And that's freeing, but then also comes the burden of actually being in charge of something and being responsible for something, which comes a lot more, criticism comes a lot more than compliments.
Now, Jake, there's a lot of cable news out there. How do you try to make The Lead distinctive? What's your brand, your signature, your lane?
Well, I can tell you what we're trying to do. We're trying to do a fun, smart news program that is like the front page of a newspaper, where if you pick up a great copy of, say, the New York Times, and there are 5 stories, one's money, one's world, one's politics, one's national, one's sports, one's pop culture, and you want to read all 5 of them. That's what we try to do every day at The Lead, and try to get a wide array of stories. We also try to do it in a way where hopefully you can't tell what my political leanings are, which helps in a de facto way with today's cable TV landscape. That distinguishes it from competitors in some ways.
And how does, at a time when we're all reading so much on our device, we seem to all know the news, how does cable news stay essential in that environment?
I think there are 2 ways that we can do it, and obviously we don't always succeed. But one of them is obviously what's going on at 4 o'clock, or what's going on at 7 o'clock or 9 o'clock, or whatever the case may be, is important, and more important than what you saw on your iPhone 3 hours before. But then also trying to get smart people and newsmakers and context to stories, things that everybody on this panel, except for Kelly, who obviously works for the competition, has been on the lead. So we're obviously going for.
I watch.
Well, thank you.
I turn up the volume. What's Jake got?
And we would have you anytime you want to come on.
Thank you.
You let me know.
I'm sure there will be a very gracious accommodation of that.
Anytime you want to come on, yeah, we got coffee for you in the green room. But Mark, Peter, and you, Mike, have all been on. We're trying to get smart people to talk about events of the day and say things that maybe you haven't thought about. Obviously, the people who watch cable news, the people who read Playbook are people who are relatively savvy news consumers. And so we need to bring something to the table other than what they already know.
Kelly O'Donnell, you've been an NBC News correspondent in New York, in LA, and DC. What is the ecology difference in those places? What's the different sense of those three big news capitals?
Well, I am so grateful that I had the chance to do work at the network level in other places, because I didn't fully appreciate until I got to Washington how everything that happens in Washington really does happen out in America too. And I found that covering everything from the O.J. Simpson trial, which was sort of my first big network long-running story, to fires and floods and those sort of urgent emergencies, to entertainment things. In those days when I was in LA, it was before Access Hollywood and so forth, so we actually did some entertainment stories. So that variety that Jake was just talking about that he's looking for, being able to do that in the course of telling stories is so helpful. During the immigration debate, well, I've been on the border doing a whole variety of stories along the border, and that gave me a little context personally. It may not always find its way into the story, but it certainly frames how I look at it. So very grateful for those experiences. In New York, it was everything from being launched to international stories to being on Wall Street, all things that have helped in covering politics here. And my favorite times really are when you get out in the country and you get to talk to real people, as we say, and see them in their lives and hear what's interesting to them. And people are quite bold about telling you what they like and don't like, and it's really great to get that feedback.
What is, present company accepted, what is the biggest failing of TV news in telling that real story of America, the bigger story of American life?
Well, one of the challenges is what it has always been, and that's the constraint of time. It's extremely difficult to boil down complex things that are layered and textured in real life and put them in a minute 30, a minute 50. That's always hard. It's always been hard. I think
when you do it, the power is incredible.
Brevity is very compelling sometimes. I think if you can, I always look at it that, we're all writers here, but for me the words are also a part of, in some ways it's like the person who's producing a record. You take the song, you take the lyrics, you take all the things the production team can put to it, and there's a different impact than just reading the lyrics or just hearing the basic melody. And with TV news, I think there's a way where you choose your words, you choose the sound bites and the images, whether they be video or some of the graphic things we're able to do, and that combination is what gives you this impact of experience of being there. And I think that's what we go for, to try and transmit the experience for people.
As you know, I'm from the LA area, and people out there just don't care about the news. Like, do people really care about what we do?
In a different way. DC is an industry town about power and politics. LA is an industry town about media and movie making and new technologies. And many social trends come from the West, which I found very interesting when I was living and working there. I don't think people care about the minutia that we care about, but that's okay. We trade on that in this town. Aptly, that's where you got that title. I tease these guys in the back. They're all signing books, and I'm like, is there a petition I can sign? I'd be happy to. So I think that people don't care in some of the same ways. They don't necessarily speak the same language of legislation or of politics, but they do care when it affects their lives. And more often than not, I find what happens in Washington does affect people's lives, and we just have to be smart about telling it.
Just to interject, if I could, I'm friends with a lot of soldiers that I interviewed for the books, and a lot of them are retired now, and a lot of them were emailing me and Facebooking me this week about Ryan Murray, and they knew it was Ryan Murray, and they knew that the retirees knew that their cost of living was going to go down or going to be cut. They were aware of it. They were aware of the budget deal in a very real way, because for these guys who don't make a lot of money when they're in the service, and a lot of them are messed up from their time in the service because of what they did for us, that's a very real way that a compromise here that everybody was heralding because it was a moment of bipartisan compromise affects people in the real world. And whether you support the compromise or not, whether you support that $6 billion cut or not, they were very aware of it.
And they've had impact because you already have, including Patty Murray, who is, the eponymous part of this deal, saying, "We'll find a way. We can find a way to adjust that going forward." Other people are looking for ways to make a change to this, affecting the increase of the cost of living for pensions. So there is an immediacy to when people feel something, they can have an impact.
All right, Mark Leibovich in This Town, in my favorite chapter, you write, Politico often gets blamed for defining down and amping up Politico news. Playbook is an insider's dog's breakfast of overnight news, press release previews, random sightings around town, and birthday greetings to people you've never heard of. Is it that bad?
I don't mean that all in a bad way. I mean, dogs eat breakfast. I eat breakfast. I read Playbook. I don't know. Again, I absolutely dispute the bad premise, but yeah, that's exactly what it is, I think.
What's the most legitimate criticism of Politico?
Would you like me to step back?
The most legitimate? I would say, putting it in the context of this conversation, it actually, put it this way. Okay. I would say this. It amplifies the insiderdom that I think can be a very, very dangerous part of what we do here, what the media does, what the leading thinkers here do. And what I mean by that is one of the many reasons Washington is seen as being very out of touch with the rest of the country is that a kind of groupthink prevails here. And it's the kind of groupthink that leads to major misconceptions about what's either really going on or really important to people, whether it's the conventional wisdom that there is absolutely weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, which of course is, the New York Times had a little hand in perpetrating also.
Why do you look at me when you say that?
We used to work at the Washington Post. We worked at the Post. No, America's not ready for an African-American president. Hillary Clinton is the inevitable nominee of the Democratic Party in 2008 or 2016. Healthcare. There was a ton of coverage in Politico everywhere about the politics of healthcare over the last year since it passed. It would have been nice to sort of actually have a, maybe more technical debate about whether this thing was actually going to work, which of course is the big story now. I don't think that Politico alone, drives that by any sense. I think that, in a sense, the business model of Politico is to be ESPN for politics. That's stated often.
Fred Ryan is here.
Fred Ryan is here. No, and it's true, and I think that that's a great business and it's a great franchise, but one, a lot of people would say that ESPN has elevated the personality of sports, somewhat coarsened the conversation of sports, coarsened the coverage of sports, and also the notion that this is not sports, this is real life, this affects real people, and sports does too, but it's different.
What's the most important thing that you've learned since This Town came out, either because of feedback from people or traveling the country doing talk shows, that you wish you had included or reflected?
One thing, it's a great question, and I have, I think, a good answer, and it reflects on what Kelly and Jake were talking about earlier. I wish I had been clearer, maybe in one page or 2 paragraphs, about the distinction between This Town, which people assume rightly to be Washington, D.C., because it's a book about Washington, D.C., but in fact, the citizens of this town are a very, very rarefied culture of people of disproportionate wealth, influence, attention, exposure, and the citizens of this town do not reflect the hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of anonymous, very hardworking people who make this city work, not to mention, the men and women who lost their lives at the Naval Yard a couple months ago. These are people who make the city work and ultimately makes the country work.
In retrospect, was there anyone that you were too hard on in This Town?
Now's your chance, man.
Too hard on?
So you're like, if you had a do-over, you would not quite say it that way.
I'm an inveterate second guesser. I mean, I second guess everything. I second guess.
Peter's nodding. He sits near
No,
Mark.
I do. I mean,
sit near him
I
all.
second. I mean, myself, most of anyone. I mean, my editors certainly. I mean, they'll all attest to this. So certainly, I would do some things differently. I would say that about anything I've ever written. I don't think I was too hard on anyone. I would probably have been harder on certain people.
Who were you too easy on?
I don't know. Wait for the sequel. No, there's no sequel.
Without naming a name, what category of person, what bucket of person were you too easy on that in retrospect you realize that's really the problem?
New York Times reporters?
I think that the ilk is pretty well covered. I mean, I really don't. I mean, I think elected officials, former elected officials, journalists. I mean, I'm pretty equal opportunity, I think.
Right. So, Peter, this is Sunday's New York Times book review, the 10 best books of 2013. There's 5 nonfiction. There's Days of Fire. How did it start out and when? What was the germ of the idea that became this amazing chronicle of 8 years?
Yeah. It actually started in 2006. Before it was over, I was very struck by how many troubles the Bush White House was having in his second term. I mean, it had started off right after the election. He said, "I've got capital. I'm going to spend it." He was at a high. He had won election without a recount, without any asterisks, and he felt expansive in his ambition, both for the country and even the world. His second inaugural address was this, extraordinary articulation of the idea of American freedom spreading around the world. And then the next 2 years was just, a dog's breakfast of misery for any president, and particularly for him. And it occurred to me this was something we hadn't seen in quite such an extraordinary way. It was worth a book. So I had the idea of doing a book about the second term.
When you started out reporting, that was what you were doing.
Yeah, I was covering the Bush White House at the time, and I started collecting string, and I had a contract at the end of 2006 and early 2007, and the idea just kind of the book changed over time. Ultimately, after the administration was over, we expanded the scope to say, okay, we're going to try to do all 8 years. We're going to try to make this, the first real history of that administration. And then, it was my friend Helene Cooper, your friend Helene Cooper as well, who suggested to me the idea of using Bush and Cheney as the narrative arc, to use them as the two main protagonists and talk about their evolving and rather dramatically different relationship that people had understood.
Peter, what's the most interesting thing you've learned or been told since the book was published that you wish was in it?
God, almost every day. Somebody says to me, I had this encounter with Cheney and blah, 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 blah.
You're like,
Or
thanks.
I was there when Bush did blah, blah, blah. Why didn't you tell me this?
Right.
And so I'm collecting string, and you have to buy the paperback. But I'm not going to give away too much, but there's a fascinating Katrina story I hadn't heard before. There's all these sort of different little moments that people told me about. Some people said, that scene in the book, it was even more so, And actually, the one lesson I've learned now from doing books, and this is the third, is that when you cover the White House in the moment, as we do every day for Politico or New York Times or CNN or NBC, it's almost always more than you suspect. Like when they sit there and say, oh, we're not debating this, or so-and-so's not in trouble, or, this really isn't happening. It's almost always happening, and it's almost always happening far more than you ever really imagined. And we should always take those kind of denials with a grain of salt.
All right, we're going to do a rapid round, a one-word answer, and then we can discuss or elaborate. But we're each going to give a one-word answer. It is more difficult to cover the Bush administration or the Obama administration. Jake Tapper.
One word?
Bush or Obama?
I'm on cable, man. You're asking me one word? Bush.
Kelly?
We get to expand, right?
Yes.
I'll say Obama.
Mark?
Bush.
Peter?
I'm going to say Obama and even it out.
Okay. All right, Kelly, expand.
Well, at the moment, I think there's an interesting issue that is getting some broader attention, and that is access to the White House. And I think that collectively we have not told our own story well in terms of traditional news media. And when I say traditional, I don't mean in the sense of where you get it, whether it's newsprint or digital. I mean in the sense of news that's supposed to report the news of the day without a lot of opinion attached. I think that this issue of access is the White House allowing coverage for official functions of the presidency, bill signings, meetings with world leaders, things where what has happened over these last few years is we'll see an official photo. And that photo is often interesting, and sometimes it appears newsworthy, but it was taken by an employee of the White House, not a group of news photographers or journalists who were able to independently attend an event, cover an event. And people say, well, it's a picture. Why not have, what do you expect? Are you just trying to do something that would make any president look bad? Are you looking for something that would be embarrassing? No, it's if the president's signing a bill that is a part of his function, if they are swearing in a new cabinet official, if they are meeting with a world leader, I think those are events of the office that should have coverage, and they used to have more coverage than they have recently.
So Kelly, why not? Why is the Obama administration going the other way?
I believe they have felt that they could go directly to the public, and they certainly can. They can have their own photos, they can have whitehouse.gov, they can have their own video service, but not to the exclusion of an independent press.
Yeah. Now, Peter Baker, the White House Correspondents Association, some other journalistic organizations have formalized their concern about this. Yesterday, there was a meeting between Jay Carney and the White House Correspondents Association, a frank and useful discussion. Is your sense, both from what you hear and from what you read between the lines of their public statement, that they get it and that they're going to respond and that something might change, or are they just trying to run out the clock?
I think they get it. I think that they will try to respond. I mean, the truth is, it's the easiest thing in the world for the White House to be nice to the photographers. I mean, the photographers aren't actually there to try to screw them in any way, right? I mean, they just want to get good pictures. They're not trying to do things that are tough or mean or in any way embarrassing to a White House. So it seems to me that the height of silliness not to facilitate all presidents, they like the photographers. When they come back on the plane, those are the ones they actually want to talk to, because the photographers
Bush called them my people.
Yeah, they're friendly. They're not actually, they're not asking tough questions. They're just trying to capture an image in a moment, and they're not, threatening in that sense. So to be nice to the photographer seems like the easiest thing in the world a White House should do.
Peter, you hear a lot behind the scenes. You have a lot of great conversations, but even more than that, you have a sense of how the Obama people think. What are they thinking? Why have they carried it to this extreme? Every White House does it. Every White House gets worse. Why is it this much worse?
Well, I do think that, this is my elaboration. I agree with Kelly's point. I also, the one I would add to that in terms of why I would say Obama rather than Bush, and Bush is difficult, his White House is difficult in its own way. Each White House has its own challenges. The thing that I miss most about this White House is what we used to call the pool spray, where they would bring in reporters to the Oval Office. The president would be there. He would be meeting with a world leader or a congressional leader or what have you, and there would be a chance for the pool to ask a couple questions about the day. Like, Mr. President, there's a riot in Cincinnati, or there's a bill on the Hill, or Ukraine is up in arms, or the uncle of the leader of North Korea has just been executed. What do you think? And we don't get that anymore. They don't do that.
Why doesn't he do that?
They want to control the message. Is what Kelly said. They want to control everything, and they think those things distract from their intended message of the day.
And they're right.
And they're right. And I completely understand their logic.
Right.
Having said that, so many events go by in which we never have a chance to hear the president's thoughts about that. The North Korea is a great example. They just executed the uncle, right, of the leader.
Not to be the number 2 guy for a while.
Right.
Yeah.
That's fascinating, and I would just like to know what the president thinks about that, but we'll never probably get that chance, because by the time the next opportunity to actually question him comes along, we'll have moved on to 3 or 4 or 5 of the stories.
And if I could add just briefly, also if you are in for the pool spray, if you're a journalist and you're in the Oval, you see which advisors are present, and that tells you a lot about who has the president's ear. You look at the event might be happening here, but I always like to look at who else is in the room, who can approach the president, and those things give you a lot of the texture of the moment that I have found so many times in covering Bush was helpful to know what might be coming next, because you get a feel for the room. If you're never in the room, you just don't have that opportunity.
Jake, what are the pros and cons of the Obama press relations? You said they're easier to cover than Bush. Like,
They're not easy to cover, and I mean, I agree with everything that Peter and Kelly have said. I mean, what the White House communication shop has done has been arguably in violation of the president's commitment, rather, to openness and transparency and accountability. And Peter's example is a perfect one. That they want to control the message. They don't want the president to talk about North Korea. He is the president of the United States. To a degree, we are entitled as the public, not as reporters, but as the public, to hear what his thoughts are.
Oh,
and
Jake.
if Steve Harvey didn't ask about it, then I don't know that we're going to hear what his thoughts are on the subject. My answer was actually personal to me. It's always weird to me when conservatives praise how tough I was on Obama when I was a White House correspondent, because the Bush people hated me. So
still do.
probably in a lot of cases still do, from covering him in 1999 and 2000. And so, however difficult the Obama people might be, at least, 25% of the time they return my call or email. That was not the case with Bush and his team.
Mark Leibovich, you have the cover story of Sunday's New York Times Magazine, the post-shame McCain. He has a quote on here: "If you live long enough, anything is possible." This is the cover. Tell us about that photo. Tell us something notable in that photo.
The money shot here is Days of Fire by Peter Baker. On his desk. The New York Times is really savvy about its sort of cross-branding and stuff.
McCain is beyond shame, but we're not.
We are not, exactly.
That looks
He's
photoshopped.
shamed. Yeah, totally, right? Yeah, this is the kind of thing where this will get all the attention and no one will read the story. Yeah. Anyone else want to look at it?
Okay, so you can save us from reading the story. You've known and covered Senator McCain since 2000. What did you learn about Senator McCain that you didn't know, or that surprised you?
It has nothing. I think just in the context of his recent incarnation, he's been a person of so many phases and so many next acts. I think he counted 25 or 26 next acts himself in his life, and it's sort of what was striking to me was how reflective he is. He doesn't. It was either a flavor of it seems like the kind of reflective that you get when someone is deciding whether to run for another term, which he is in the process of deciding.
What do you think he's going to decide?
I think he wouldn't admit this. He didn't admit this because I asked him specifically. I think a lot of it will depend on whether the Republicans win the Senate next November, because he would be Armed Services Chairman, and he wants that very badly. If they don't win, he doesn't get it.
You read the article, you think he's going to run again.
Yeah, although I wouldn't. Look, he changes his mind a lot. He absolutely.
Helio, you think he's going to run?
I do. I think he's one of those people who is so in the game, and I don't mean that to diminish the importance of what they're doing by calling it a game. He is someone who thrives off of the activity, and I think one of the lessons of McCain is that you can have many acts. And that is interesting in American politics, that you can reinvent a bit, you can evolve or change, or you can be down and then get back up. So I don't see him wanting to get out of it. And with respect to his age, I think he is among the older, but has a more youthful spirit than some of the older senators. And, his mother is living into her early hundreds, so I think he would reject the notion that he's too old. That's my guess.
Mark's story is great, and people should read the whole thing, not just your nice excerpting this morning, Mike. But one of the greatest anecdotes that I've heard before, but also is in Mark's book, is for John McCain, retirement equals death. Mm-hmm. His dad retired and died.
Yep.
The next day.
And when you have... Now, the New York Times has Roberta, John McCain's mom, as 101. Yeah. I don't know how much your fact checkers looked into that, because
she's actually
I think
201. We missed it.
She's been 101 for quite some time now. I don't know when people lie. When you get 107 and you start lying about your age, you're 100.
Forever. Yeah, when you hit 100, you can
I'm only 100. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, old age is not a thing, and retirement to him, honestly, is mortality.
All right, another rapid round, a one-word response, and then you'll be free to elaborate. The news media leans left, yes or no?
Yes.
I think,
That's already 3 words.
yeah, in places, yes, but not entirely.
Mark?
Yes,
Peter?
Yeah, there are moments, but there's more to say about that.
there is more to say about that.
Mark, you didn't hesitate.
Speaking in Washington, D.C., as a resident of Washington, D.C., as someone who practices journalism here, in this town, I can say I rarely talk about politics with my colleagues. Most of my colleagues, I have no idea what their politics are, including everyone sitting on the stage. But, I mean, think about it. I live in Northwest Washington. None of my neighbors are evangelical Christians. I don't know a lot of people in my kids' preschool who are pro-life. I just think, and I think when you do have conversations in all the newspapers I've worked at about politics, doesn't happen often, but you see clues that there is absolutely a leftward lean.
Jake, you didn't hesitate either.
I didn't hesitate, but I'm glad I had a chance to expand, because I know just the 4 yeses are going to be taken by Brent Bozell, and that's the end of it. But it is much more complicated and complex, which is a certain type of person becomes a reporter. And generally speaking, these are people who have not, generally speaking, I'm not saying every reporter in the world, but generally speaking, the kind of person who is a reporter in Washington, D.C. or New York City has never worked a minimum wage job outside of high school, when they work at Baskin Robbins or whatever, has never experienced poverty, is not an evangelical Christian, like much of the country is. There are a lot of experiences that the kinds of people who are reporters, editors, producers, et cetera, in Washington, D.C. and New York City have not had. Now, that said, I think there is an awareness of that, and when there is an awareness of it is when the best journalism can happen, because then people are aware of the country that they're writing for, the country that they're on TV for, and the desire to get out of Washington, get out of D.C. and talk about experiences. But it's not just that the media leans a little bit left. Most reporters, I don't know their political leanings, but most publications, you can kind of get a sense of what the editors are thinking. I would put a lot more on the editors and the senior producers than I would put on the day-to-day reporters. But you don't see a lot of coverage of poverty. You don't see a lot of coverage of troops. You don't see a lot of coverage of faith. It's simplistic to say it's liberal or conservative. It's about experiences and
Lifestyle.
and I think there needs to be more getting outside of our comfort zone.
I think if we're biased, I think, look, as everybody said, I mean, if you did surveys, and they did do surveys, more reporters report themselves as being liberal or democratic than not. A lot of us try to deal with it in different ways. I don't vote. I try very hard to stay out of that. In my family, I do have evangelical, I have people on all sides in my personal family, and that's helpful, I think, to understand different parts of the country. But I think our bias, really, the issue of bias left, right, the bigger bias is the bias toward conflict, the bias toward sensation, the bias toward, the quick and easy and the simplistic, and that's our bias, and that's what we have to fight every day to try to capture the world as we cover it in a more substantive, sophisticated, three-dimensional way. All the different aspects of society Jake just mentioned that we overlook too much would be part of that.
And before I get tweets about this, I'm not talking about every reporter. I'm sure there are lots of reporters out there who have experienced poverty and have served in the military and have evangelical relatives.
To be sure, later in the panel, Tapper revisited the statement.
Well, and I felt I had to say yes because obviously MSNBC has evolved. I was at NBC before MSNBC existed, so I've watched that change, so I feel it's important I acknowledge that. At the same time, I also think that personally I've worked very hard throughout my career to be as intellectually aggressive about both sides of the aisle and some places in between in order to not allow myself to sort of be animated by political feelings. I really enjoy the political discourse. I don't feel particularly swayed one way or another. And that has taken a lot of effort over time, if you care about politics, to be able to try and be arm's length. I also think one of the things in encountering people around the country, and I have been assigned to cover Republicans a lot in recent years, and people interpret that as I chose to cover Republicans, not understanding that we do get assigned. But when you're out in an environment that might be a town hall meeting or an event that is very conservative, and you have a chance to talk to people, I've heard quite a lot of their criticism, and I take it seriously. I also think that if that is the world in which people have lived, they are also less likely to be drawn into the media if they have been raised in a community, whether we're talking about a school, church, or a town, that thinks the media is not even-handed or fair. You aren't typically drawn to pursue in life something that you think is not doing its job the best way it can. And I think that filters some of how people go into the job.
All right, I'm going to bring you into the conversation in just a moment. If you have a question signal, we'll bring you a microphone. But while we're doing that, I'm going to ask Peter a Twitter question from B. Koenig, I believe, 94. Will Obama enjoy a similar resurgence of popularity after office as Bush and Clinton?
Yeah, I think the history shows that most presidents do better when they're not president. Eisenhower's had a resurgence, particularly in the last couple of years, been 4 or 5 books talking about how he was a much better president than we gave him credit for. Truman is the ultimate example. He's the one that Bush in particular hangs his hat on. Truman left office in the 20s or 30s. He was, bad war, really disliked by a lot of the American public. Today, we venerate him as the architect of a Cold War strategy that lasted for about 40 years. Look at Reagan today. People, we talk about Reagan as an icon, and it strikes me that at the moment, Reagan was very controversial. A lot of people didn't like him. So I think, yes, I think most presidents tend to look better after the fact when we tend to move past the passions of the moment.
Even Nixon.
Yeah.
Very specifically on year 5, Peter Baker's wife, Susan Glasser, has done a fantastic job as editor of Politico magazine, and they have a piece up right now talking to historians about the 5th year of presidencies, who had the worst 5th year, and a very common answer was FDR, and an answer was Reagan.
Yeah, look, I mean, FDR, comes out of the re-elect feeling his oats. He's feeling quite empowered, and he overreaches, basically, and he gets sort of snapped back as a result. And that's a lesson that presidents seem to learn over and over again.
Question for the questioners. Who's first?
He had the best 3rd term, though.
By far.
Do we have a question while we're waiting for that? I'm going to ask Jake Tapper. You were an early adopter, innovator on Twitter. You're aggressive. You're prolific.
That's not how my wife would put it, but okay.
On Twitter.
Early time waster.
How has social media changed in the last year? What do you see happening in 2014?
Well, I can't speak for anyone else, but for myself, Twitter is where Twitter is my Drudge. Twitter is my Huffington Post. Twitter is where I find stories, where I find out things.
But Politico is your Politico.
Of course, Politico has always been my Politico, and nothing else will be my Politico. But honestly, I mean, but Politico, I find out about a breaking news story on Politico on Twitter. I follow a number of you guys. I follow you. You not, by the way, particularly active on Twitter, I should point out, Mike. But Dylan and a whole bunch of your reporters, Glenn, are on Twitter all the time and promoting each other's stories, and that's where I find out about them. But I follow, unbelievably, more than 2,000 people, and from all walks of life, from all over the world, and it's a way I find out about what's going on. Not to take away from Drudge, who is more successful and popular than ever, but it's honestly it's a real-time news feed. It's also a way to interact with people, but I find it most valuable as a news source.
It's like the old AP bulletin wire.
Except better because it's every publication, and even obscure publications, telling you what's going on from all over the world. And sometimes when somebody will put out a list like, 20 unconventional women reporter muckrakers you should be following, I'll follow every one of them. And sometimes they're writing about Australian social policy, and maybe it doesn't really enhance my knowledge of things I need to be covering, but maybe all of a sudden my eyes are open to something that I didn't know about.
Now, Peter, you're chief White House correspondent of the New York Times. It's your job to think big thoughts, to have deep conversations. How do you do that in the age of Twitter?
That's a great question. I mean, look, when I started covering the White House, it was 96. It was Clinton's heading towards second term. And it was so quaint. We had these little beepers, and if you wanted to know what was going on, they would send out a page letting you know there was a statement in the bins. You had to physically go to the White House and pick out the paper statement, and you wrote more or less once a day around 6 o'clock. And today,
With a feather.
with a feather and a quill, it was awesome.
Ride your pony to the White House.
Carrier pigeon, and we trudged 20 miles through the snow. It's 1,000 times different, and Twitter is now, I think, an important way of getting out information, getting out news. I learn a lot from Twitter. It's sort of like a stream. You kind of dip in and out every once in a while. You can't possibly absorb it.
I follow everybody here on Twitter, definitely. And you three are pretty good.
Thanks,
Thumbs
Jake.
up, there you go.
There's
So,
only
yeah,
one
but
follower that counts.
By the time you get to that print edition story, you've done often, 3, 4, 5, 8 times a day, different things, podcasts and so forth. And so it's a challenge to try to think and make that extra phone call that you don't have time to do.
Kelly, I'll pull back the camera. Beyond Twitter, just the instant news era where there really is no news cycle, like how does that change how you do your job? And do you see changes in the way that our leaders act?
Well, I think that in cable news, we had a bit of that need for immediacy that we've been kind of ramping up over time in terms of my deadline might be a live shot at 11 a.m. and then another one at 1 o'clock, and then there's Brian Williams at 6:30, et cetera, et cetera. So we are writing, rewriting, continuing to report through the day, in some ways like radio would be. And we do that as well. So I think we are multitasking in new ways. I like Twitter for the situational awareness it gives me about what's happening on the Hill.
That's a good term, yeah.
Everything from, the vice president has arrived, someone might tweet that out, or I'm heading to the floor to make remarks on such and such, and it has been very, very helpful. Those who really know me know that I am not technically savvy, thank goodness. There are lots of people around me who tell me which apps to use and which technologies to embrace, and I'm glad to follow them. So I bring my 8-track and my blue disc, and I come to work. I have caught myself at times being at a news conference and the only one with a paper and pen. And I think that there are different ways you can be old school and new school. I think that clearly members of Congress have embraced using some of the social media. Some of them do it themselves. Chuck Grassley, who is known for tweeting when he sits on his wallet, or those who have staffers who do it. And you can tell sometimes the voice of the person coming through. And certainly they have used their Facebook pages and various outlets to communicate directly to their constituents, which is terrific. But there's a utility for reporters as well.
Now, Senator Grassley clearly tweets himself, and if you look at his feed, you'll conclude that.
Yes.
But a lot of these guys don't.
And I often ask them if they actually do it themselves. And then you'll find some who will dictate it. It will be their voice, but they may not be actually operating the
And I think
device.
that's, Mark, is that what Senator McCain does?
Yes. I think
I think it's a mix, actually, although he did actually have his driver tweet while she was driving. Scandal alert. And that's one of the reasons he has 1.9 million followers right now, which is by far the most of any Republican in the Senate, except, Marco Rubio's second with about 400,000.
Okay, we're about to get the hook here. Anybody can jump in on this. What is a source of news? So that can be a columnist, it can be a website, it can be a publication that is obscure, but that you consider essential.
Well, I wouldn't tell you.
The Iron Sheik's Twitter feed. Everyone should follow the Iron Sheik and Jose Canseco.
Who's a good non-obvious tweeter? So you can't say Chuck Todd. Who is a good non-obvious tweeter to follow?
Great, he's Michael Beschloss, the historian.
Yes.
Oh, he's great.
Fantastic.
Those old
He's got a cult
photographs he
following.
has.
He's the Chuck Grassley of presidential historian. Which is not to say he's quirky. I mean, he's really smart. It's really interesting.
And what I love about that is if he's tweeting a historical photo in an age when Twitter did not exist, and you have sort of the clash of the moment, it's great. The other thing that I was struck by in looking at some of his tweets is you will see the rope line of a president of times gone by, and people were actually looking at the president in the eye and shaking his hand, not doing it like this, where they're trying to take a selfie and meet the president in the same moment. It is dramatically different now that there's a blue light at every event that is a major newsmaker because it's the glow off of people's devices. They're not actually just looking at that leader or campaigner or politician. It's an interesting social change.
You know who was interesting to follow? He's no longer tweeting. Is Natsec Wonk. Because, I mean, he wrote nasty, obnoxious things that I'm not going to defend, but his was obviously a very insider. I mean, I'm saying this as somebody who followed him for months, if not years, a very knowledgeable insider take. I didn't know how insider at the time. I assumed he was like with a think tank or something, and a very acerbic view of foreign policy, and obviously very, very well informed, which obviously ultimately cost him his job.
Last question, and you can jump in any order. So a lot of people in this audience, a lot of people on live stream who want to be you. When you talk to young people, what is your advice about how to succeed in journalism, in DC, in life?
Me? Okay. So I wouldn't tell them how to succeed in life, but the one thing the two things I say are learn how to be a print reporter before anything else, before you enter broadcast, before you enter radio, go to a daily or a weekly and learn how to write day in, day out. And work really, really hard and realize that rejection is 95% of the job, but it's the 5% that will get you where you want to go. And those are the things. I tend to expand a little bit more, but those are the two things I say.
I think for young people, I would say that enjoy the fact that you have some advantages in knowing the technology, being in the moment, getting a pulse on things, but at the same time have a regard for what experience gives you, and that's lots of mistakes along the way, lots of learning from being there. The experiences I've had over my years, time and time and time again, there has been a scenario that I've seen before, a pitfall I've encountered, and you bounce back from it, you keep going. So there is so much more to learn and enjoy it in the moment.
I would just say get out of town. I mean, get out of wherever this town. No, I mean, it's funny. A lot of at the talks I've been giving around the book, a lot of young reporters have come up to me and like one specifically said, you know, I'm a reporter for the Concord Monitor. I'm 25 years old. I'm really impatient. I see all these people at Politico and BuzzFeed and Huffington Post, and they have 30,000 people following them on Twitter, and I want a piece of that. It looks so exciting. It's like you're actually living in a community. The stories you're writing are affecting people you see on the street every day. I mean, the whole ephemeral buzz of having a Twitter following and actually being close to the people giving is something you can do later, maybe, but live your life.
Peter?
Oh, I tell them not to do what I did, because in fact the path that I followed and that you followed no longer is the path in journalism, right? You go to the Fredericksburg paper, and you go up from there to the Richmond Times-Dispatch, the Washington Post. You work on the Metro desk. You cover Fairfax County, and eventually you make your way to national affairs or what have you. And there's just the world's different today, and every path is different. What I tell people is, embrace the new technology, embrace the new different possibilities out there, but hold on to the old values of journalism that we cared about and still care about, I think, today in terms of accuracy and fairness and completeness and balance and so forth. So to me, I've grown less. I still love getting the print paper. I get 5 of them at home. But I don't think it matters as much anymore how you get your news, as long as what's produced comes out of those essential values that we had.
And Jake, very quickly, in The Outpost, the tragedy that is chronicled here was determined to be partly a result of leadership failures. What was a leadership lesson from The Outpost and from the reporting that you did around Afghanistan?
I'll keep it here in Washington because obviously there were leadership failures that had to do with the placement of The Outpost in the location where it was put.
And failure to respond to fix it.
I mean, there were so many leadership failures. One of the big ones was that in order to do the job that these soldiers were tasked with doing when the book starts in 2006, but then through the end of it in 2009, they didn't have enough troops, they didn't have enough assets, period. There were not enough helicopters in the country, there were not enough soldiers on the ground. And that's for Secretary Rumsfeld to discuss at another time. But that's a huge leadership failure. And I would also say that when it came to the Obama administration, there was a lot of focus early on by not just the people in the White House, but also the people across the river in the Pentagon about who was going to control the surge, who was going to control AFPAC, who was going to control the next direction of the war. There was a lot of back and forth between McChrystal and Obama and Lute and Jones. And at the end of the day, I can't help but feel that all that wrestling for power and control and resentments over leaks and this and that took away from what the focus should have been. And I'm not just speaking about the policymakers, but also us in the media. I certainly was more focused on the drama than I was on what I should have been focused on, which is ultimately why I wrote the book, which is the soldiers on the ground, their families at home. Do they have enough to do what we're asking them to do? And those are just huge leadership failures.
And as we say goodbye, Kelly O, you're the only person on this panel who has been on Jeopardy. What was that, what was that like?
Terrifying and yet fabulous. It was a charity game that we played last year. Alex Trebek was a lot of fun. It was a great experience, and it's all in the buzzer. All in the buzzer.
We're appreciative of the people in live stream land who've watched it. We're appreciative to the Bank of America for making these conversations possible. Thank all of you.